Started. So, hello everybody. My name is Emerson Sarmiento, and I'm part of a team of MBA students leading this research. Um, and this research is about how organizations are working together to address some of the world's most pressing environmental challenges. Our work really looks at what actually motivates collaboration and whether sustainability frameworks help to encourage more landscape level approaches. I am joined by my incredible research team of other MBA students, Malky Rothman, Annie Keating, and Dominique Mayu. And of course, we wouldn't be here today without the support of Stephen Rosenzweig from General Mills and Shafali Mehta from Open Rivers Consulting Associates, who really generally supported us and advised us throughout this entire project. And we're excited to share our findings with you and really glad you all can join us. So I can start sharing my screen, but to kick things off, I'd like to invite Steve to say a few words about how this project came together, and followed by Shafali, who can do a brief introduction to the work as well.
Thanks, Emerson, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Steve Rosenzweig. I'm an ag scientist at General Mills. And thanks to Shafali, I had the privilege of supporting the students on this project for the last several months. They're a really impressive group of people, as you'll see, and they've done a great job tackling this really complex but important topic on the intersection of landscape approaches and this evolving world of sustainability frameworks. Before I turn it over to them, I can offer a quick corporate perspective on why this topic matters right now. So for food companies, most of our climate and nature footprints sit in the agricultural sector. So we're largely working at the scale of whole regions where our agricultural ingredients are grown. And the kinds of things that we're working towards in those places, like addressing risks to water and biodiversity, mitigating climate change, and building resilience in agricultural systems, those aren't just things that companies in the value chain want. Those are shared outcomes for everyone who cares about those places. So from farmers and local communities to governments and all of the companies across different sectors whose businesses depend on the farms and natural resources in a region. That's why at General Mills, we've been working on collaborative, place-based approaches, trying to coordinate action across multiple stakeholders towards shared outcomes at the landscape level. And at the same time that we're seeing the need for those more coordinated, approaches, most of the sustainability frameworks that shape the paradigm for corporate accountability that we're in are based on individual company targets and metrics, which encourages behavior that's more narrow and linear. So like focus on your value chain and set requirements and push them up to your suppliers. And that approach can be important, but it's often not sufficient or efficient when the challenges are fundamentally place-based and the levers for change sit across many different actors. And it creates limitations for companies to invest in landscape initiatives if there's a sole focus on individual company value chain targets and metrics. That more collaborative work just might not be recognized. So that's why this evolving external landscape of frameworks that you'll hear about is so important. They don't just help companies measure sustainability performance, they help shape incentives. They influence what companies prioritize and how they allocate resources and which approaches companies are recognized for. And all of that influences the level of impact that the private sector can ultimately have in tackling complex sustainability issues. So that's a big question for our sector that the students will or have dug into is whether the current and emerging frameworks are actually aligned with collaborative place-based work or whether they'll continue to reinforce a more like individualistic value chain only approach. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Shafali.
Thank you, Steve. So I had the pleasure of getting to meet Bard folks last year when I taught the MBA supply chain course, and it's exciting to see several familiar names in the chat right now. After one of the classes, Emerson approached me and asked if I had an active supply chain project. And as those of you who run your own business know, we don't always, we have a lot of variability in our pipeline, and I didn't. However, thanks to Steve and the energy of this Bard team, 9 months later, we've been on a very cool journey. And I was reminded a very important lesson that fits into, I think, what a lot of us do in agriculture and beyond around collaboration is when we connect with each other, we take risks, we step forward, and we just ask the questions like Emerson did of me, some pretty magical things happen. Today's presentation is going to be somewhat similar to the Winter Olympic highlights reel. It's going to be inspiring, thought-provoking, and exciting, but it's really hard to do justice to over 2,000 athletes competing over 2 weeks. This team dug fairly deep into many complex areas. They pulled up nuances, and many of you who are actually joining were critical and offering your insights and thoughts. And so we have an invitation to many of you. As you go through this presentation, if it piques your interest, it's an area you're excited about, we would love to partner, dig in deeper with you, invite you in to invest with us, because there's a lot more work that has already happened, that could happen, that are solutions. And I think this team has really kind of opened up a lot of areas and would love to, I think, continue this momentum forward from what they're going to talk about today. And finally, I think a lot of us know that our vocations are exciting. They're a lot more fulfilling and joyful when we have teammates who are truly excellent. And so I'm really lucky. I think I got to have that experience that these folks, so Lauren and the Bard students, Annie, Dominique, Emerson, and Malky brought. So thank you all, and I hand it back to you.
Thank you, Shafali. Appreciate it. So before we get started, just a quick reminder that we are recording this session so we can share it afterwards. We're also going to put together a short brief that you'll be able to reference as a resource. And then lastly, to the audience, please use the webinar Q&A section if you have any specific questions, and we can answer them either in real time or address them during the Q&A portion. So if you want to address specific questions, use the Q&A button. Of course, you can make comments and chat as well, but for questions, please use that. So with that, let's get started. Pass it on to Dom.
Great. So today we're going to share our research and findings on how landscape-based approaches and sustainability frameworks come together to support efforts and where they fall short in uplifting coordinated on-the-ground implementation. We'll start with the background and purpose behind the research before moving into our core findings from our analysis of frameworks, case studies, and interviews. We'll talk about implications and give our recommendations and leave time at the end for discussion and Q&A. So this project originated because there's a rising interest in landscape and jurisdictional scale approaches as nature-based commitments grow, but implementation remains fragmented and often company-specific and under-resourced. We were motivated alongside General Mills and curious to explore if sustainability frameworks could act as a shared language and tool to encourage implementation and collaboration at scale. We think the work's important because we want projects to be as impactful as possible so that funding and efforts aren't wasted. Even when companies and organizations sponsor these projects, it's the people on the ground implementing landscape-level nature-based solutions that ultimately take them to completion to bring the meaningful outcomes across stakeholder groups. We wanted to know if sustainability frameworks are enhancing that work or creating a disconnect between corporate reporting requirements and implementation best practices. So to kind of level set here for our presentation so that we're all on the same page, we want to set a foundation of what we're referring to when we talk about landscape and jurisdictional approaches. These terms are often used interchangeably, but they do represent distinct levels of action. So we'll start with nature-based solutions, which focus on protecting, enhancing, or restoring ecosystems to address business and societal challenges, such as water security or community resilience. Place-based solutions are tailored to the specific ecological, societal, and economic realities of a location, rather than to a single company's reporting or footprint goals. These kind of level up in scale to landscape approaches, which coordinate nature-based solutions across an ecological region, such as a watershed, and require collaboration among many actors. Jurisdictional approaches fall within the landscape approach category, and they operate within a defined government boundary, like a city or state, and require public sector leadership, policy alignment, and multi-stakeholder participation. So with this, now that we've shared understanding of the approaches, we can move on to define what we mean by frameworks.
As we dove into this research, trying to understand how sustainability frameworks might encourage landscape approaches, The first challenge we encountered was defining what we even meant by sustainability frameworks. Defining and categorizing frameworks and understanding how they function to encourage action became a foundational and challenging component of the project. We took a broad approach to defining sustainability frameworks in an effort to best understand existing guidance that would encourage the adoption of landscape initiatives. We included instruments that span the full governance chain, from defining global nature outcomes to enforcing place-based rules to setting corporate targets and to enabling transparency and decision making. Many frameworks that solve a different part of the sustainability action problem. What we found is that we could broadly categorize the frameworks we reviewed into 3 categories, though they're not entirely neat or mutually exclusive. The Global Biodiversity Framework and ISSB were examples of guidance frameworks that provide principled and sustained metrics to help companies decide what to focus on and how to report. GRI, SBTI, and SBTN were examples of voluntary disclosure frameworks, which set more specific methodologies, targets, and expectations that companies opt into. Mandatory disclosure frameworks were legal or regulatory reporting requirements and included new reporting regulations like CSRD, as well as mandatory due diligence like EUDR. The relationship between frameworks became important to understand as well, such as the use of the Global Biodiversity Framework as the core reference point for the science-based targets for nature's biodiversity target setting voluntary disclosure. What these frameworks have in common is that they were designed to translate planetary and social limits into decision-making structures for governments, companies, and finance, intended to help close the gap between global sustainability goals and real-world economic behavior. When we started this work, our hypothesis was fairly intuitive. Sustainability frameworks are often described as a shared language, something that could help align companies, governments, and practitioners and make collaboration at a jurisdictional or landscape scale easier to initiate. In theory, frameworks should reduce friction. They should create clarity, align incentives, and make it easier for multiple actors to move together towards shared nature-based outcomes. What we found in practice was more complicated. Sustainability frameworks largely incentivize individual action and accountability, not collaborative convening for shared purposes. Across case studies and interviews, frameworks did not play a meaningful role in supporting nature-based landscape initiatives. They didn't bring actors together, mediate trade-offs, or sustain collaboration over time, even though the appetite to collaborate was consistently strong. Instead, we found that sustainability frameworks were very separate from the convening, initiation, and sustained coordination of landscape approaches. Existing frameworks are firm-centric, designed to identify risk, guide company-level disclosures, and ensure regulatory compliance. With short and inflexible reporting timelines, complicated attribution rules, often misaligned incentives, and sometimes conflicting directives between different frameworks, we found that they often increased burden and fragmentation. The key insight was that sustainability frameworks are not the best tool for encouraging landscape initiatives. Collaboration for these types of projects comes from trust, shared initiatives, and dedicated convening capacity, which are not meaningfully encouraged by the current sustainability guidance and disclosure frameworks. This gap between expectations and reality became a central thread through our findings, and it shapes our overarching themes.
Thank you, Annie. Yes. All right. So what we heard across interviews and case studies was pretty consistent. First, frameworks are not driving collaboration, so they actually played a limited role in that kind of coordination. Uh, they weren't the mechanism that sparked joint action or kept things moving. So that's not surprising because nearly half of the frameworks that we looked at are designed with single participant focus, and only one that we reviewed actually requires multi-stakeholder collaboration, which is the Global Biodiversity Framework. At the same time, as Annie mentioned, the appetite for collaboration is really high. Stakeholders want to work together, especially where there's shared business risk or there's place-based urgency, or where situations that just one single actor cannot solve the problem alone because either of weak traceability, such as long supply chains, or system complexity. So for producers also, the willingness to collaborate increases when the incentives are clear and the economics make sense, like if it leads to longer term contracts, for example. So where things actually break down is coordination capacity. So across the interviews, successful initiatives all had trusted intermediaries like the California Water Action Collaborative, for example, the Nature Conservancy, or similar organizations that play that convening role. They had clear ownership, decision-making processes, and sustained investment behind it. We also heard that there's a lack of people whose job it is to actually coordinate, convene, and translate between business needs and the local realities. So this led to one of our strongest conclusions, which is that collaboration is not a motivation problem. It really is an operational system problem. So while current frameworks help document and validate the work, which is really important, they don't actually bring actors together. So without proper governance and coordination capacity, frameworks have little impact on collaborating people. Another consistent pattern that we saw is that reporting and compliance can be demanding and it can divide everyone's efforts. So across the cases, we noticed that measurement is often missing or it's vague because attribution is really difficult. So for example, in the California Water Action Collaborative projects, such as groundwater recharge or watershed restoration, the focus is on improving shared basin conditions. So claims were intentionally avoided because it's unclear how those attribution actually results. And that actually helps with collaboration in the short term, but it also limits companies from making long-term investments because they can't tell their story or justify their investment. Uh, and that's why carbon projects are actually a lot more common, and we heard that throughout the interviews. Carbon is easier to quantify and claim, and it makes it a useful entry point, but our research shows that it often crowds out other outcomes like water and biodiversity because it's harder to measure, not because it matters less. So frameworks reinforce this because many of the frameworks we reviewed, like the GHG Protocol, Carbon Disclosure Project, California SB 253, and Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, are all fundamentally GHG emissions focused. Ultimately, without a trusted measurement partner and a shared methodology, actors working toward the same goals don't have a common way to compare their strategies, to understand what the trade-offs are between those strategies, or track their progress. And that lack of shared measurement makes alignment over time really difficult. So across our research, it was very clear that frameworks fail because particularly in encouraging implementation and collaboration at scale. So reporting often creates additional demands and it takes away from investments and actions on the ground. Companies are asked to comply with overlapping frameworks, each with different definitions and metrics, and also expectations. Our research shows that that fragmentation is actually made worse by where reporting sits organizationally, where it's often owned by finance or compliance, which is separate from sustainability teams that are responsible for setting targets and directing those investments. Also, claim wars are a major barrier to collaboration. So across the research, we confirmed that companies often pull back once they realize they can't clearly or safely claim the outcomes for risk of double counting or greenwashing. And when actors don't have shared reasons to work together, like addressing supply chain risk, organizations default to what each framework asks for individually rather than what would actually improve outcomes on the landscape level. So participation also drops when the data collection doesn't lead to further funding, cost sharing, or for reducing the risk for the producers. A consistent theme was that frameworks don't reflect how nature or place-based work actually happens on the ground as well. Frameworks are optimized for reporting and not adoption. A majority of the frameworks we reviewed don't explicitly support that kind of work. So, for example, farmers and implementers are asked to make long-term changes like agroforestry, but success is often judged using short-term metrics like acres planted. And that doesn't really reflect the reality of a longer-term transition of certain initiatives. And the result ultimately is inequity. Farmers and local implementers carry most of the data collection burden, while corporates capture most of the reporting benefit. Smaller organizations often lack the capacity to comply at all. So this showed up repeatedly in the research in both interviews and case studies where participation really depended less on their willingness, but more on the capacity to report. So the final question we asked was, what actually enables landscape and place-based approaches to work? The answer wasn't more frameworks, it was infrastructure. So effective initiatives have a dedicated convening capacity with staffed funded coordination like implementers, nonprofits, local producers, or a corporate lead. They rely on trusted, neutral intermediaries to bring actors together with clear governance and shared decision-making structures across that collaboration. They also assign incentives around collective outcomes as opposed to individual attribution. So in the watershed case studies, for example, partners don't claim individual impacts. Instead, they describe their collective investment and how it supported watershed level improvements, like how it's reduced overall wildfire risk. Among the existing frameworks, science-based targets for nature, SBTN, comes really closest to the direction. So it's rooted strongly in ecosystems and local nature loss. It actively encourages multi-stakeholder collaborations, and it highly promotes nature and place-based solutions. But even there, it only works when it's embedded in the broader operating system for collaboration. So in short, frameworks can really support the work, but the infrastructure is what determines whether landscape approaches actually scale.
So if we step back, the question really isn't whether collaboration is needed. It's clear from what everyone's shared so far that the appetite is there, as we just heard. And the real question is, what conditions make collaboration possible and sustainable over time? First, we have to fund the work of collaboration itself, not just the outcomes. Convening stakeholders, mediating trade-offs, maintaining momentum, aligning incentives, this is the real work, and it requires staffing, coordination, and long-term investment. Too often, that work is assumed to be informal, absorbed into already stretched roles, or layered into organizations without dedicated funding. But without someone clearly responsible for holding the center, collaboration stalls. Clear policy direction and incentive alignment matter deeply as well. Fragmentation across agencies creates confusion. Long-term funding for coordination reduces it. And practitioners emphasize that pilots are not enough. Durable programs, long-term measurement systems, and accountability mechanisms are necessary infrastructure, not optional add-ons. Across all actors rather, the pattern is clear. Collaboration succeeds when governance is simplified and transparent, when coordination is funded, when incentives are aligned early, when measurement supports learning rather than compliance alone, and when the work reflects the realities of the place. Frameworks may provide language, but collaboration is what moves itself when infrastructure, trust, and shared ownership are built intentionally. Second, we need to reposition frameworks as support tools, not as drivers. Frameworks can provide structure, as we've heard, they can create shared language, but when they dominate the agenda, they often add burden rather than clarity. For teams that are already constrained on capacity, reporting can crowd out implementation. So instead of asking how collaboration can satisfy frameworks, we might ask, how can frameworks better support the work already happening on the ground? How can they connect field level realities to decision makers without distorting incentives or fragmenting effort? Third, measurement needs to be used strategically in service of impact, not bureaucracy. Measurement should inform decisions. It should enable learning and accountability. but it doesn't need to be perfect to be useful. We need to ask, who is this measurement for? What decision will it influence? And what level of evidence is good enough to move forward? Especially in landscape level collaboration, we discovered that where outcomes are collective and attribution is complex, rigid claims requirements can actually discourage participation. So we need practical approaches to recognizing shared progress. Finally, we have to broaden who can meaningfully participate. Complex compliance demands and high reporting thresholds often exclude the very actors closest to the implementation: smaller producers, local organizations, community leaders. If collaboration is meant to be place-based truly, then participation pathways have to be designed with those actors in mind. That means reducing administrative burden, designing for co-creation, and ensuring that the work remains practical, not just technically compliant. Strengthening collaboration isn't about adding more structure. It's about building the right infrastructure, governance, funding, incentives, and measurement so that collaboration can function as intended. So what does make collaborations work? We asked practitioners and the stakeholders that we spoke with, what enables progress for them, and the answers were remarkably consistent, which is a theme you'll hear over and over again throughout this presentation. For consumer goods companies, collaboration only works when coordination is shared and resourced. Neutral convening cannot sit with a single corporate actor. It must be co-funded and jointly owned. Another repeated barrier was duplicate reporting burden. When each company requests slightly different data or aligns reporting to different frameworks, friction multiplies. Aligning data requests and timelines reduce that friction and make participation much more feasible. And importantly, business goals and timelines need to reflect on-the-ground realities. If success is defined only by near-term claims or credits, collaboration becomes extractive rather than place-based and supportive. For producers and farmers, collaboration works when it is co-designed, when priorities, practices, and definitions of success are shaped together. Buy-in increases and outcomes improve. Implementation constraints, such as cost, labor, risk, timing, must be surfaced early, because if they are ignored, participation drops. Trusted advisors and peer learning networks consistently emerge as key enablers as well. Trust travels through relationships, not reporting templates. For NGOs and intermediaries that we spoke with, neutral convening and trust building are foundational. Clear governance and defined decision rights reduce ambiguity and prevent conflict. But equally important is translation of the work, connecting field realities to buyer requirements and documenting what works into credible case studies and practical templates. Without this bridge, alignment breaks down. For government and jurisdictional actors, success depends on clear policy direction and aligned incentives across agencies. When departments are coordinated, participation becomes significantly easier and more effective. Strong funding coordination between public and private actors as well reduce fragmentation and unlocks greater impact. Finally, stakeholders emphasize the need for long-term measurement systems, programs that extend beyond short-term pilots, and other accountability structures. These elements form essential infrastructure for sustained progress.
To answer our core question, can frameworks act as a shared language to encourage collective action? We used a mixed qualitative research approach designed to balance theory with real-world practice. We conducted a review of sustainability frameworks, including guidance frameworks, voluntary and mandatory disclosures. Our goal was to understand the landscape of sustainability frameworks, their relationship to nature-based solutions, place-based initiatives, and multi-stakeholder collaboration, as well as how they were designed to encourage action, and whether those mechanisms support collaboration at a landscape scale. We reviewed a set of in-depth case studies and place-based and jurisdictional initiatives across regions and commodities. These helped us understand how collaboration actually functions on the ground, what governance and funding structures exist, and where, if at all, frameworks showed up in implementation. We conducted interviews with 22 practitioners across NGOs, consumer goods companies, producers, intermediaries, and sustainability professionals. These interviews were critical in grounding our analysis in lived experience, surfacing constraints, incentives, and trade-offs that don't always appear in published literature or frameworks themselves. Taken together, These three lenses allowed us to assess patterns, test assumptions, and distinguish between what is theoretically encouraged and what is practically enabling real-world landscape collaboration. To understand whether sustainability frameworks actually support landscape approaches, we reviewed a wide range of leading frameworks across guidance, regulatory, voluntary, and mandatory disclosures. We looked specifically at how they address place-based action, nature-based solutions, and multi-stakeholder collaboration. And what we found is that while frameworks are effective at structuring reporting and accountability, most fall short of supporting the core elements that landscape approaches require. After reviewing more than 30 frameworks, we asked a more specific question: what frameworks explicitly require or actively encourage companies to pursue place-based solutions, nature-based action, and encourage multi-stakeholder collaboration in those actions? This table summarizes what we found in the frameworks that did address all three areas, which were only a small subset. 3 frameworks most clearly aligned with all 3 approaches, though in pretty different ways. The first 2, the Global Biodiversity Framework and Science-Based Targets for Nature, function very similarly to the way that the Paris Agreement and SBTI function to enable action on climate. The Global Biodiversity Framework sets global goals and targets for halting and reversing biodiversity loss, and the Science-Based Targets for Nature operationalize GBF, requiring target-setting companies to assess where their impacts and dependencies occur by watershed, biome, landscape, and set regionally specific targets. The EU deforestation regulation is not a framework that supports corporate disclosure or target setting, but it does provide a mandatory framing that uniquely supports landscape initiatives as well. It addresses a limited impact deforestation, but does in practice provide a forcing mechanism to implement nature-based solutions that are place-specific and that encourage multi-stakeholder collaboration throughout supplier networks. Other guidance, mandatory, and voluntary frameworks reference these concepts, often indirectly or at a high level, and frequently as a possible solution to addressing corporate risk. So while elements of landscape thinking appear across frameworks, they're uneven, optional, and rarely operationalized, which limits their ability to meaningfully encourage landscape scale action. When frameworks require or actively encourage nature-based solutions, place-based approaches like SBTN, they signal ecosystem action is credible, expected, and decision relevant. Explicit references to collaboration give companies defensible reason to participate in pre-competitive or cross-sector initiatives, which, when outcomes are shared and attribution is complex. Mandatory frameworks that require engagement throughout the supply chain, such as EUDR, CSDDD, push companies to interact with suppliers, jurisdictions, and intermediaries rather than act in isolation. By framing nature loss and land use changes as systematic risks, aligned frameworks make it easier to justify investments that reduce shared exposure at the landscape level. As Emerson spoke about earlier, even though there are frameworks that, in theory, may encourage landscape initiatives, they remain limited in their ability to enable collaboration in practice. SBTN, in particular, is still very new, still continuing to evolve through pilot and refinement cycles through 2026 as it scales. It may become a shared language to incentivize corporate place-based initiatives and engage local stakeholders in solution implementation, but SBTN, like other frameworks we reviewed, does not provide guidance or clear governance to define what that collaboration looks like, which is essential for successful landscape initiatives. SBTN, underpinned by the Global Biodiversity Framework, is getting closer to supporting landscape initiatives with a focus on nature-based, place-specific target setting, and regulation like EUDR is forcing companies to procure in a way that could encourage landscape initiatives. But all the frameworks that we reviewed are still constrained by the same factors of other frameworks that limit the necessary conditions for landscape initiatives in practice.
A core element of our research was a review of case studies to analyze real-world examples of our hypothesis in action. We thoroughly evaluated 15 viable case studies, some of which were commodity-specific, others focused on mitigating regional climate risks, and they spanned across continents. While compiling case studies, it was pretty clear that there aren't many that analyze successful landscape-level approaches, and there are even fewer within that subset that have connection with sustainability frameworks. The goal of this portion of the research was not to highlight perfect models, but to understand what enables progress in real-world conditions. As Emerson mentioned in our findings earlier, frameworks were mostly peripheral. They aren't designed to encourage multi-stakeholder collaboration. They're a reporting tool for corporations. This meant that case studies generally didn't include whether or not a company was involved because of their disclosure or reporting requirements. Companies became involved when incentives aligned with their existing sourcing or sustainability commitments. These often focus on specific, such as key commodities, supply regions, or anti-deforestation and net zero commitments. Governance was underdocumented, which is critical for long-term project success, and equity during project creation and implementation. Stakeholder roles were often unclear, and many stakeholders are involved. They ranged from NGOs to government, CPGs, and community actors. Some questions that continued to come up were who are funding the project, who's responsible for continued implementation beyond the initial funding, and who's bringing the technical expertise. So here we're sharing a few of more success story case study examples, and we're highlighting ones that involve CPGs as key project collaborators. So the Rio Grande Water Fund's goal is to protect storage, delivery, and quality of Rio Grande water through landscape scale forest reforestation treatments in its tributary forested watersheds, overall improving stream health, mitigating downstream effects of flooding, reducing forest fuels for wildfires, and securing sustainable financing. Main stakeholders on this project were General Mills alongside the Rio Grande Water Fund, which consisted of around 100 signatories in a more participatory approach. So some real pros of this project are it used that participatory approach. It clearly aligned with best practices for landscape initiatives with good monitoring and adaptation plans for continued implementation for 20 years. It took into account the cost of prevention versus the cost of reaction by looking at cost versus damage from previous wildfires that had happened in the region. It also allowed General Mills to claim successes regarding forest reforestation. There were no mentions of framework alignment in this case study, which kind of contrasts the Cool Soils initiative. There was clear alignment here with Greenhouse Gas Protocol product standard framework and SBTI, and companies involved were able to make claims based off of it. The Cool Soil initiative is one of Australia's leading low carbon sourcing programs for food and beverage companies. The goal of this group and project is to quantify greenhouse gas emissions from key commodities such as wheat and identify avenues to support farmers in reducing emissions with a focus on soil health. Practices used included a low and no-till, livestock integration, and precision fertilizer application. Main stakeholders involved here were Mars Pet Care, Kellogg's, Manildra Group, and local universities, farmers, grain processors, and aggregators. They really had a strong network of stakeholders. This case study was successful because the companies, corporations, NGOs involved worked alongside 200 farmers over a 5-year period thus far, because this is ongoing, and there's been meaningful impact. They've been able to combine monitoring, reporting, and verification alongside trusted technical service provision, and so that's really built validity and strength in the project. And then we have the Almond Project, which has taken place in California. The goal here is to test and compare regenerative soil health practices versus conventional management in adjacent almond orchard blocks to measure ecological and economic outcomes. CPGs were hoping to gain in this project some supply chain resilience, pre-competitive collaboration, to demonstrate regenerative sourcing and support brand-aligned impact claims through using practices like cover crops, compost, grazing integration, and biochar application. Stakeholders here were Simple Mills, Daily Harvest, Capello's, Treehouse Almonds, White Buffalo Land Trust, Pacific Ag Management, regional technical service providers, the Savory Institute, researchers, and really the local farm community. This project is a success because it's created a scalable template for nature-based commodity innovation and was farmer-led. So it shows that pre-competitive brand and grower collaboration can fund credible measurements while providing ecological improvements and integrating economic modeling in the communities. A key takeaway from case study review is that it's complex to bring together stakeholders in a landscape level, and that there's a lot of room for clearer documentation on the infrastructure required to make implementation successful. The sheer amount of dollars and effort that goes into these projects is enormous, and the industry would benefit from more best practice examples. Though SBTN attempts to, disclosure frameworks haven't yet shown the ability to account for the material benefits that come from biodiversity, societal impacts, and greater climate resiliency. Corporations need to consider how the ways they report either help or hinder this on-the-ground implementation.
To ground this work in lived experience, we interviewed and synthesized insights from stakeholders across producers, NGOs, CPGs, jurisdictional, and private actors across food and ag. We wanted to understand how landscape approaches function in practice beyond the desk research that we did. Where collaboration breaks down, we wanted to understand what enables trust over time and how frameworks are actually experienced on the ground by having these real-time conversations. Companies in many cases do account for farmer realities in their programs. They understand implementation constraints, but most frameworks are sector agnostic. They are not designed with agriculture's biological timelines, risk profiles, or operational realities in mind. When farmer realities are not embedded at the framework design level, the result is friction, even when intentions are aligned. Second, place-based action resists standardization. Landscape change is systemic and context-specific. Soil types differ, water systems differ, local governance differs, community relationships differ. There is no one-size-fits-all model because they attempt to standardize what is inherently contextual. Practitioners repeatedly emphasize that landscape approaches require flexibility, yet frameworks often reward uniformity. Third, language creates friction rather than clarity. Sustainability terminology and framework language are often abstract. Instead of enabling collaboration, it can obscure action, especially for producers or local actors who are focused on operational realities rather than reporting categories. Shared language only works when it is intuitive and grounded, otherwise, it does become a barrier. And fourth, collaboration truly is desired, but structurally it's unsupported. Across sectors, stakeholders express a willingness to work together, but they lacked convening power, they lacked time, they lacked neutral coordination, and frameworks definitely did not fill that gap because frameworks don't create governance, trust, or sustained coordination capacity. When we looked more closely, we saw that these structural gaps manifest differently depending on the actor, but they point to the same underlying issues. For producers and farmers, the challenge is risk. Adopting new practices often carries multi-year uncertainty with unclear payoff. Capacity constraints like labor, technical support, time make sustained adoption difficult, and incentives do not always consistently reach the farm level. Premiums, pricing mechanisms, and long-term commitments are often unstable or indirect. For NGOs and intermediaries, the constraint is coordination. Convening requires trust and a neutral backbone. That coordination work is real labor. Governance is often unclear, who decides, who's accountable, how trade-offs are resolved, and funding gaps for facilitation mean that initiatives stall when pilot funding ends. For CPGs and private actors, the burden shows up as distortion. Reporting requirements can require high-effort compliance with unclear value. There's often misalignment between what companies want to do on the ground and what is deemed material or claimable under the frameworks. And while shared action requires shared incentives, the infrastructure for collaboration, dedicated roles, funding agreements, formal governance, etc., is often absent. The core takeaway from these interviews is that frameworks alone do not facilitate collaboration and that the constraint is not willingness, but rather the absence of enabling infrastructure, shared ownership, effective governance, sustained coordination capacity, and aligned incentives. These are what practitioners consistently identified as necessary, And critically, these gaps are not solved by adding more frameworks. In some cases, additional frameworks increase fragmentation, adding reporting layers without strengthening coordination. If collaboration is the goal, then the focus must shift from refining frameworks to building the conditions that allow collaboration to function.
All right. So we know that reporting frameworks are an inextricable piece of corporate sustainability reporting. And this throughout the project just kept us thinking about, well, what would they need to enable and enhance collaboration rather than exist in the periphery? So this is our wish list for new framework development so that they could better support landscape level nature-based solutions. We believe that frameworks would need to be designed for collaboration rather than individual company goals. Many stakeholders benefit when regions increase resiliency, but measurement and claims oftentimes get in the way. They would need to reflect operational reality so that what they measure matters and it doesn't limit impactful project development. We saw this in a case study example where it was clear that bringing in continuous living cover would improve environmental outcomes, but the potential for increased greenhouse gas emissions made companies weary to invest. Reducing burden, duplication, and aligning requirements should be prioritized to minimize implementer burnout and to maximize adoption. Decision makers should understand field level needs, both around the realities of data collection and what would be most impactful across stakeholder groups. This idea plays into supporting equitable governance to reduce top-down project creation and create lasting change.
All right, so thank you, everybody. So to change the slide, to close, we just want to say that what we found was really clear. Frameworks are not what makes landscape approaches work. The shared need from collaboration does, and collaboration only hold when there's real ownership, governance, trusted coordination, and long-term capacity to support it. And frameworks can be really useful, but only when it supports that foundation and when it incentivizes the real actions on the ground. So if we want nature-based solutions to scale, the focus has to shift from reporting alone into investing into the work of collaboration itself. So what comes next is really an invitation to all of you who are in the audience to continue this ongoing work. The research is really meant to open up a reflection. How have the targets, disclosures, frameworks, how have they been shaping the way you work today? And based on what you've learned and heard, where might there be a space to think or rethink how those tools are used going forward? So we invite you to keep the conversation moving, to question what's working, what's misaligned, and how these approaches can better support people, places, and long-term outcomes over time. Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody being here. And from here, we're going to go to the Q&A portion. But before we go into that, I just want to acknowledge again the hard work of the research and support team. I included our LinkedIn handles here if everyone wants to connect and have further questions. In addition to myself, Malky, Annie, Dominique, we also had a great support from Lauren Ng, particularly in shaping the case studies, findings. And of course, thank you again, Steve of General Mills, for supporting our learning and for being generous with your time and your thoughtfulness throughout this project. And Shafali from Open Rivers for your support and advising us from start to finish. We are incredibly grateful. Okay, questions. Let's just take a moment to see if people have asked questions.
Haven't seen any come in, but while folks are thinking, maybe I'll throw out a question for you all. I'm just curious if anybody wants to say what you knew about this space of sustainability frameworks or landscape approaches coming into the project, and like what resonated with you, what really interested you about it, and if it changed any of the way you think about your future career paths or professional interests. Just interested in the impact the project has had on you.
I can start briefly with that. Thank you, Steve, for that question. It's really important. For me, I think the first week or even more was understanding what these terms meant. So we called this the nature-based solution project, but as we moved along the project, we started talking about landscape solutions and jurisdictional, and I think the barrier of the language was real, but once we got to understand that, it was a lot easier to move through. But that's certainly one thing from the start of this project to the end is just understanding what these terms meant, and it was really important. And then as far as what it did for me personally, um, this is an area that I haven't had a ton of background in, and just learning a lot of different initiatives, learning who the different actors are, was really important because I'm really interested in supply chains and understanding the different type of projects that are related to that. So it was incredibly helpful and very supportive on my own personal learning. So thank you guys.
Looks like we have a question from an audience member. So I'll pose this to the team and whoever wants to take it. We have a couple of questions here. Is it the opinion of our team that frameworks should be facilitating collaboration or that another mechanism would be more effective or appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I think what an opinion that I have on this is that frameworks at least shouldn't hinder collaboration. So even if maybe they aren't the mechanism that bring companies to the table, that they're facilitating this collaboration and like larger scale projects, they really I don't believe that they are helpful when they're encouraging siloed projects and they're encouraging companies to just kind of focus on their own value chain. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
One topic that came up, and I think this is from practice, again, with many of the folks that are on this call, is we're always resource strapped, right? I think agriculture, maybe other sectors would argue, but I think ag, we're definitely always like, we're trying to do the most with what we have, which means every ounce of energy that we devote has to be so thoughtful. And sometimes it happens if we have to overemphasize or really divert energy into frameworks, it means that some of the elements that, were outlined here end up being deprioritized, and that becomes really difficult. And the outcome is like what you were saying, Dominique, is we end up being siloed, we fall away from the outcomes. So there's really this question here around really resource optimization. We have limited choices. How do we collectively, as this community, work effectively with what we have? And I'm thinking that actually connects to the second question that someone had about organizations and structures for convening and collaboration. Is I think this is, again, a big topic for many of us who are involved in the space. We're looking for ways that we can keep optimizing our collaborations. And I think there's some really cool models that have come up, and the ones that were outlined here are definitely it. I think there's space for us to continue to maybe challenge ourselves and really keep asking, how do we effectively like learn from what we've done and increase, I think, some of these pieces. And I think Dominique, again, I think the hindrance, like remove those hindrances where possible, because it feels like it's a race against what we want to do versus what we have available to us to get it done.
Um, just to add on to my thoughts on um, what structures are needed. So for me, my background has been in impact measurement for over a decade, and it was pretty surprising. Well, I guess I wouldn't say it was surprising. I kind of knew, working in that space for a long time, that measurement can really be a barrier because of the complexity, because of the fact that there's no standardization. But certainly there are organizations out there who specialize in impact measurement, whether they're working with corporates or nonprofits, where they're working towards standardization, making capacity easier for both nonprofits and corporations. Um, I think I'd love to see more efforts in that measurement and evaluation space um, when it comes to standardizing, creating common language, making it easier, and providing capacity to the people on the ground so that people will understand where they are and potentially where they can go through benchmarking and things like that. We have another question here. If anybody wants to take it, what are your plans or ideas to follow up on this great work you've done? For example, will you evaluate what is preventing projects from getting started?
I mean, I think that's sort of our ask of this audience and members of companies who are doing nature-based projects or sustainability reporting is what else would you all like seen done in this field and are you interested in supporting additional student research because we're happy to continue pulling the thread. We just need some community to do it alongside of.
And just one more piece, I think, on that prior question of the organizations or structures to provide the convening and collaboration. I think that's we could have an entire webinar or full day course on that because I mentioned there was so much that came up in the interviews and the discussion. We really didn't have time to dig in depth into what are some of those traits that we're seeing that really help enable that kind of collaboration. So it's a great question. I should really dig into what are some of those elements. Maybe that's a nice follow up. This team is up for that to really go into those elements. And there has been some really cool work that has been done. I think, General Mills, like Steve, you guys have done some work with several folks around like highlighting because some of those traits vary depending on the landscape, the folks, the outcome, the timing, but just like cool patterns on things that we're learning on that really enable those collaborations.
Well, thank you guys. I know we're at time. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak before
Emerson,
we
there was
conclude.
one more question in the chat about the shift in the mindset of private
Oh, I didn't
sectors
see that one.
that needs to be done.
I didn't see that one. Do you want to?
Yeah, it's here it's just a question of is there a shift in the mindset of especially the private sectors that needs to be done so away from ego-driven competition towards collaborational work.
I can maybe start that one, but I'd be interested in your thoughts as well. But I think there's definitely companies that yeah, I think there's a lot of companies that are investing in this kind of work without realizing how they would get credit for it. I think that's part of the issue that was uncovered here is these external frameworks which are used by investors and raters and rankers and investors. They really those external organizations can provide a lot of the incentives for companies to do these sorts of things. But in the absence of that, companies, we really have a need to be doing them anyway. So we can't really let that lack of external incentive slow us down from doing the work that we know we need to be doing to be impactful. And I think there are many companies that do get that and are acting kind of without that in that uncertain world of how we're going to get credit for those sorts of things. And I think we need to kind of further align those external incentives with that real need on the ground. And that's just how we'll get more companies, more investment, kind of more sustained action if we can bring those two things together. Because in the meantime, we can be doing things for the right reasons and the right mindsets, but we need to funnel kind of everybody into that same path.
And I think that mechanism, Steve, it's like the reality of challenge is like we might all want to do the same thing, but we might have just be literally on different budget timelines or different framing timelines or different staffing timelines, and that like can throw it off. I mean, there's just so many real operational elements that come into doing what you described. So there's this piece of the mindset, and then there's the reality of how do we line up that mindset. And then the more folks, I was thinking I got to be part of see the Midwest Row Collaborative, and I think that ROP Collaborative had so many people in it. So the intent was great, but just how do you coordinate across so many different people and get all those points to line up? So there's also this piece of just kind of being able to dive a few layers under like what we're seeing on the surface and what's actually happening. That can sometimes maybe that's part of the challenge too is the communities involved don't always get to see that mechanism at play.
All right. There was one more question that came in, but I know we're at time. Aaron, I think already might have left, but we can answer those questions offline as well. There was a question about cool soils, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. Again, thank you to the team and thank you to Steve and Shafali. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Take care.